Okay, hey class. So, what I'm going to share with you now is a lecture on prototyping, and I got to tell you, I love prototyping. Um, it is my favorite thing. And the reason I love prototyping is because I'm a terribly afraid, risk averse person. I get freaked out by so much. And what I love about prototyping is it's a way to help me put my fears at bay, because one of the things prototyping can do is it minimizes the risk of kind of normal, kind of big scary stuff, and it finds a way, at least how I define prototyping, it's a way that you can kind of take on big potentially scary challenges in a way that's not as scary. So let's hop in. Okay, so prototyping, if we think about like what is a prototype, there's some very common conceptions, and you will do this because you're all going to do the reading, I know. All right, so if we think about what a prototype is, this is a really classic example. This is the OXO Good Grips peeler. It's really, one of those things, if you've seen the movie Objectified, right? This is what, we often think of, where it's like you're going from on the far right, the kind of early version, to then thinking about like, all right, how do we hack it? How do we kind of change the the handle? And all of these things are prototypes because they're clearly not the real thing, right? But they're explorations. And you can see this kind of progression in terms of explorations in form, right? How does this go from, maybe we hollow it out, maybe we add some kind of channels in it, all these different things that come together to help show the designers, a pathway from, a kind of very rough version to something far more refined. There's another type of prototype, and this is like called a functional prototype, right? So here we've got this kind of 3D printed parts, and this is actually for this new kind of server that has some different type of memory routing that happens. So here what they're doing is they're just basically what they're trying to figure out is, if we put a bunch of traffic through the server, like, will the server melt? Is it going to work? Is it going to break down? And you can see they've got this kind of cheese board set up, which is what that thing is called, with all the little kind of holes for the bolts to go in. And that allows them to basically reconfigure things. If they're like, oh, we need an extra part here, we can put that there. We can do this, we can do that. So this is a functional prototype. It doesn't look like what the final thing will look like, but it's just there to see whether or not things will work. And then as we get further along, this is a picture of an Icon aircraft, and this is still a prototype. It's very resolved, right? You wouldn't want to test like we're like, well, I hope it works, let's go fly it, right? That would be disastrous. This case, though, it's a prototype where it's fairly resolved, but you can see those little markers. They're these things called telltales, and what those are is they're sensors that will give it information about optimizing how the plane flies. So they knew it could fly, but now maybe they're testing, well, like, how responsive is the throttle? How does it handle kind of turbulent wind? They might be testing all sorts of things that are not going to change whether or not this is a plane or how the plane functions broadly, but it will give it a sense of optimization. So all of these are prototypes, right? And that's true, and that's fine. But the way that I think about prototyping is far more expansive than these. So up till now, this is how most people think about prototyping. Now you're about to get like a little, you don't get this anywhere else, folks. This is how I think about prototyping. So this is an example, right? And here's a guy doing something super challenging, really risky, complex, right? And this has a lot in common with launching a product or service, right? So if he messes up, he's going to get hurt, right? So it's super risky. It's really tricky, right? There's all these variables that he has to deal with to figure out to make sure that he can land this trick without getting hurt. And the way that BMX riders have prototyped this kind of thing is they created something called a tramp bike. And so what it is it looks like this, and it's kind of like a bike, except that you can't ride it, right? You would never, it makes my teeth hurt to think of trying to ride this down the street, right? It's got no wheels. It's got no pedals, right? It doesn't have brakes. So what they've done is they've stripped off all these important pieces of it. They've left the handlebars and they've covered it in foam. And the reason they cover some of the ends in foam is because it comes into play when it's used on a trampoline. So here you can see it in action. So this is someone using a tramp bike to prototype a trick, right? So here he is practicing a trick And this is for me something that helps me conceptualize how I think about prototyping, right? So this is in this clip, it's 16 seconds long. He tried 11 tricks. That means if he was on the trampoline for 5 minutes, he could attempt about 200 tricks, right? 200 attempts. Think about that. If he were on a track in 5 minutes, right, like we saw in the prior slide, he could maybe get in, 2 or 3 tricks every 5 minutes, not to mention how expensive it is to, like, you need access to a track. You need probably, I'm sure there's insurance. I would make insurance if I were running a track. And so there he gets increased learning, right? It's also, this tramp bike makes it much less risky, right? So what happens is if he falls, he bounces right up again, right? He's not going to break his back or break a leg if he just lands in a horrible position, right? He could land on his head and still be okay. Whereas if he lands on his head on a real track, he's quite injured. And then the other thing is that this doesn't take a lot of investment, right? This is an old bike and a trampoline, right? It's not like super, it's not multi-million-dollar sports arena that kind of helps him, optimize something. He doesn't have to be a professional athlete to be able to practice in this way. So here is how I define a prototype, right? It's an intervention which enhances our ability to learn. That's the key part, right? About an element of the design challenge with minimal risk, investment, and time. So this is how I would like you to conceptualize prototypes, and I'll show you why. So here, this is kind of a typical product development cycle. Early on, you want them to be low res, right? Later on, they're going to be much higher res, much more resolved. But what you want to do is make sure that you can really push the exploration to the far left side of this curve when it's not going to cost a lot, right? Let's say, if we think back to the Icon aircraft that I showed you a couple of minutes ago, if suddenly they're like, you know what, maybe an aircraft isn't the best way to kind of solve our design problem. What if we, what if we thought about making it sort of like a kind of circus that anyone could be involved in, right? Suddenly they have sunk a lot of cost into an airplane, right? So that is not a time to have a radical departure in how they're solving the problem. Now, on the other hand, early on, maybe if it's just a sketch or something, then it's pretty easy to be like, what if it's an airplane? What if it's a deep sea scuba diving adventure series for solving their challenge? So early on, you have a lot more latitude to play with a wide range of ideas. And that's why I'm showing that on the far left, the scope of your prototypes can be incredibly varied. But as you get further down the process of the product development cycle, you want that scope to narrow. So to the point where a lot of times if you're like, well, we have an app that delivers dog food to elderly people, right? That may be that's what your app is. And then you might be optimizing like, well, how do we make it so that it's usable for those kinds of people? That's kind of the level of specificity that you're getting to. And the great thing about low-res prototypes are that they're fast, they're less risky, they're solution agnostic. And by that, I mean you're not wedded to doing any particular type of outcome, right? You're not saying, well, I'm good at building apps, so I know it's going to be an app, right? Because you're not kind of bound by different tools or kind of like different expertise, you can be far more open to the types of things you solve. And then they're more inclusive because they don't require special knowledge, that means that more people can contribute to ideas. So it's a way thinking about this. Now, if we think about the prototyping landscape, so here there's objects, right? So there's like low resolution. This was a belt company that I made, Booyah Belt. The first prototype I made for it was just out of a piece of this one. It was actually out of a piece of cardboard. The one I'm showing here is even higher than that. There's interactions. There's lots of ways to explore. You may have heard, paper prototyping is really common in UI UX circles, right? That's a very low resolution way of exploring a more refined system. And one of the things that's super effective and the reason I love low resolution prototypes is that if you're trying to build something that doesn't exist, no one has developed tools for that. Right? So you have something like Flinto or Pop or Sketch or Axure or Proto.io, any of those things that are, UI tools, right? Those didn't exist before UI became really kind of mainstream, right? So if you're trying to do something new, chances are the tools don't exist, and you're going to have to find ways to work around that. Now I'll show you an example. This was, I was working at Intuit, and I wish I'd come up with this, but someone else had. So there was a phone tree, and basically it was for, I think it was for TurboTax or QuickBooks, I can't remember. But basically the customer service phone tree got awful scores. All the customers hated it. And they had an idea about, the product manager had an idea about how to fix it, as did the developers, and they talked to the developers, and they said, like, okay, hey, what do we need to, here's what we think is wrong. We think it's just the menu structure is kind of weird. Can you fix it? And the developers were like, it's a legacy system. It's going to take like 6 months and $2 million. It's a real gnarly mess. Like, we don't want to, it's going to be a bear to fix. Product manager was like, look, our customers are like hating this, and we're bleeding money because they're so pissed off about it. We're losing money. So it's worth the $2 million. But they said, well, what if we can prototype this before we invest in that $2 million? And so what they did is they had an idea about how they could fix it. And then they routed just a small portion of the customer service calls that were coming in to the product manager's desk phone. And then what happened is she picked up the phone, and she had a script. So she would say, thank you for calling Intuit. For help with TurboTax, say 1. For help with QuickBooks, say 2. And then the people would be like, 2. She'd be like, great. So I see you want help with QuickBooks. And then she would read a script that was basically their idea for what they were going to do and have the engineers do, but not a single line of code had been written, right? So what happened, they were able to test with like 50 people. All of a sudden they get all this data, and then because they were, and they made sure that they actually got the people help. They weren't just like tricking them. But what they did is then they followed up, and they found out much more about how their prototype worked. And it turns out their assumption was wrong. And so had they not prototyped, they would have wasted all that time and all that money just to come up with a kind of mediocre solution. But instead, they quickly prototyped it, and then were able to learn from it, so that then when they did invest the money, they had much more confidence in their solution. So super cool story just about creativity that, by the way, didn't come from designers. It came from folks who were in the middle of the business, right? But that sense of creativity and ability to solve a problem was super powerful. There's another story here around, this is a product I developed for, okay, so there's, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I'm going to tell a story. Okay, so this is a product. This was a gestural camera. This is back in 2008. And I was working at this place called Kicker Studio, a design company that I helped found with some other folks. And basically, this was a gestural interface at the time where there were no gestural interfaces. And so we knew there were technical limitations, like it could only read like your hand, like a mitten. It couldn't read like 2 fingers, 3 fingers, things like that. So we were trying to figure out, how do we make a distinct gesture set that will be easier to use than the remote control? And so we started kind of
I'm worshiping like Mecca.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
The one that looks the best.
Any trouble
Middle Eastern world.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
as we're going through this.
the one that looks the most sane,
this
like a
interesting
gesture,
thing
is
happened
just
where-
the one where you just stop like this and you leave it
And we
there.
had some design
But we said we were going to do that
principles.
from mute.
Oh wait, what if? But like,
Wait,
what
no,
if
that's
you?
too easy.
What if you hold it and you leave it out there for 5 seconds and it turns it
Yeah,
off?
that's right. You could hold out your hand.
Still doesn't beat the
And then
No.
right here, like, we're in a room in just a real space, and a fly goes by.
God forbid if there's
And
a bug in the
suddenly-
room.
Yeah, it's like,
You're just gonna be like,
Like, light comes in, and I'm right, and then we realize, like, yeah, if you're just waving away a fly, like the channel's going to be changing or the volume's going to be going up and down, and it's just this chaotic mess, right? So that was like the first round of prototyping, right? So we figured out, okay, there's a couple of things we need to make sure it's easy, but it has to also be distinct, right? It can't accidentally get triggered. And then what we did is we went across the street to Adaptive Path, who was right near us at the time in South Park in San Francisco. And what we did is that's me in the background. I've got a wireless keyboard, which was like a big deal at the time. A wireless keyboard, and I'm standing behind her, and she's being given instructions. And then I was changing a YouTube video based on what she did. Right. So in doing so, we learned all this stuff, and we learned about like left-handed, right-handed, all these assumptions we had as a team, and it helped us quickly discover them. And then you might see in the background the guy, he's sketching, and we actually came up with a different type of gesture set that was based on kind of the old iPods at the time that had this kind of click wheel thing. And then from there, we tested that in real time, right? We prototyped it right away, right? High levels of iteration. Then we kind of shared the final gesture set, and then this was something that they launched, and they actually got bought by Hitachi, which was kind of their plan all along. But anyway, it was this incredible way of like moving really quickly with lots of kind of openness to try something out and then get feedback from it. I already told you all about the example of the restroom at the D school, so I won't go into that. And then here is an example of prototyping that I did at Capital One, where we had all these teammates involved. And so here you can see really crappy prototypes, right? But we use them as a way to get the team involved. And so as you can see, they start to get a little bit nicer, and we start to hone in. But this is something that was super useful in getting buy-in from a bunch of people on the team. And then as we gained more confidence, we made the sketches a little bit nicer. And then here we had this idea about video chat, and we're sharing it with an executive. And then we used a keynote kind of presentation and a FaceTime call to sort of simulate this idea of a video chat. And here you can see someone testing it out. And basically I had my counterpart on the East Coast on FaceTime pretending to be this banker. And there was a way that in doing so, we got like real feedback, but we were just completely messing, we were hacking existing systems in order to get learning. That's the key thing. It was always about getting learning, right? And it turns out they didn't like it. And this other idea ended up being far more effective. So here, the other thing is that if you think about prototyping, right, that what you'll get from the article is decoupling the idea of the output from the thing itself. So you can use a puppy to prototype having a child, right? Now, a puppy is not going to become a child. It's not like a crappy version of a child, right? The puppy is never going to develop into an adult human being. But it's linked because a puppy can teach you a lot about what it is to be a parent, right? And so in that sense, it's instructive, but it's decoupled from the idea of the thing itself. And if you think of it, the tramp bike does the same thing, right? It's not connected. The tramp bike will never be able to be ridden. But if you separate those, suddenly, then you're able to get way more learning in less time. And so that's one way to think about just how you can kind of use, that's my dog. Look at that. Oh, he was a puppy. That was before we knew he was horrible. But, how cute, right? But again, also, like, he was super cute. Like, I fell in love with this dog. Then later he became kind of a nightmare, but it was too late. I loved him. And I was like, I guess like I have a better sense of what it would be to be a parent now. I'm also really glad I'm not a parent because, man, that is hard. Anyway, I think my paternal, any kind of parenting energy I have goes towards like pets and trying to be a better teacher. So, all right. So here, cats are also kind of a lower resolution version of that, just like because cats are easier than dogs. This I want to share with you because everyone should know this. This is just a really classic prototyping image of a surgical tool that was developed during a meeting at IDEO with the things that were based on that were sitting around on the table. And then finally, I want to look at this. This is rebar, the parklet movement that you might see if you are in like San Francisco. Oakland has a lot of them. I'm not sure if Sacramento does yet, but basically the way they prototype this parklet, rather than asking permission, they got a pocket full of quarters and they went and some sod and a bench and a tree from Home Depot. They rented all of it. They rolled out the sod, and for 2 hours they just had this parklet in a parking space, right? And in doing so, they were able to learn so much more about that by just doing it rather than like planning it out and trying to just send a PowerPoint deck to the mayor and all that stuff, right? They just did it, they learned, and actually what happened is like a couple of days later, the mayor contacted them and said like, this is an amazing idea. Can you how do we make this kind of more of a kind of official thing? And then from there, they did a bunch of, they actually got a whole kind of sanctioned setup, and they're like now parklets is like this global movement. So final thing, this is a prototype for or this is one of the more final products for like a new type of prosthetic. And this guy Van Phillips made 200 to 300 prototypes before they even stopped breaking. Right? So just to give you a sense of like how much work goes into prototyping, right? Now, this was like he already had the idea, but what I want to impress upon you all is like you can do that many prototypes, and you should be thinking about prototyping that rapidly, that with that much that prolifically, that quickly, because it's the every time you're learning. And it's just, if you have this assumption that like you'll do 1 or 2 prototypes and you'll have it all like wrapped up, you're not really thinking about just how much learning you'll need to get in order to get a really good product. Okay, so that is, so that's all I got for you today. So I know, sorry, that was a longer one of these lectures, but I love this stuff, so deal with it. All right. So for Monday, make sure you get your concept, because from there, then we're going to do some work with your concepts to think about how you take those and prototype them in a super creative way. All right. See ya.